can tell you not to sing your story? Who all can tell you that you're singing off key? You are the dancer, you are not the dancer. You are the song, not the one who sang. Be a beautiful songbird. No, you tell the truth. You tell the truth.
Welcome, everyone. This is Thrive with Morella. This is the show for people who want to thrive, body, mind, heart, and spirit. So chronic pain. Either you or probably someone you know has had to deal with chronic pain because the problem is such a big problem nationwide. But what do we do for chronic pain? Tylenol often doesn't cut it. And some of the solutions out there are quite problematic. And so my guest today is Brendon Lundberg. Brendon, I want to tell our listeners and our viewers a little bit about you before I officially welcome you. So Brendon Lundberg is a previous chronic pain sufferer himself, and he became intent on building and bringing to the people a safe, consistently effective solution to the chronic pain epidemic that we're dealing with. And driven by this mission, he co-founded Radiant Pain Relief Centers. Brendon is radiant, and he combines his mission to change the way chronic pain is treated with deep experience in healthcare management, marketing, business development, and sales. Prior to opening the first Radiant Pain Relief Center in 2014, Brendon played key operational and business development roles for two growth award-winning companies in the Portland area, and was the director of sales and marketing for another Portland-based medical device startup. Brendon is also the author of the book, Radiant Relief, a case for a better solution for chronic pain. Brendon, welcome to Thrive with Morella.
Thank you, Morella. I'm honored to be here. Really pleased. Thank you.
I've been really looking forward to our conversation because I'm one of the lucky people to not have experienced chronic pain other than, like chronic tension in my shoulders or neck. And, that's a pain.
Yeah, sure.
But I know it's not the issue of chronic pain that we're going to be talking about today. So I always start off, as you know, asking my guests just a quick, what is one of your personal keys to thriving in life?
Well, that's a great question. It's something that I've really arrived to through the process of becoming an entrepreneur, I think, because I've always been the type of person since I was a teenager, thinking about I can be happy in the future when X happens. I delay some level of gratification or excitement or happiness. And I think that the key to life is to learn to be happy in the present. And then whatever it is you're working towards, if it's something big or important, it's almost like just icing on the cake at that point. So, right. And it hasn't been an easy process. I've invested pretty heavily in my own personal development simultaneous to building the company, and both have been a great school.
Yeah, and I've read your book, so I certainly have read about some of the significant challenges that you've had to overcome personally, financially, so many challenges for your business and your personal life that I really know that you mean it when you say, it's all about living in the present. And so I love that. Thank you for starting us off with that. So, Brendon, in your book, you talk about a pain epidemic, chronic pain epidemic, and I use the words opening the show. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about why you think it's an epidemic and how do we get here?
Well, first of all, pain is probably the most human single common denominator. I mean, there's not a single person that's ever lived on earth that hasn't experienced pain, right? So it's right. A very much both a literal and a metaphoric kind of subject matter, I think, in many ways. But chronic pain in the United States is documented to be by American Academy of Pain Medicine and a number of other organizations to be a 100 million person problem, which is more than cancer, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease combined. So that does make it an epidemic. I mean, that level of societal impact is epidemic level. And we have this opioid addiction epidemic, and that's also a term that's pretty commonly used. It's an epidemic, and it is. When you had in 2017, 72,000 people die of opioid overdoses, and you have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people whose lives are pretty disrupted because of these medications that they've been prescribed or that they've been taking in order to try to manage their pain. So we really have a fundamental misunderstanding of pain, and an urgent kind of need to address it in a safer, more effective way. And we just feel so honored at Radiant to be able to have such a therapy and such a vision.
Right. And you make a point in your book that I had never realized it. I'd never stopped to think about the fact that the way the medical profession is structured, and even alternative care practices are structured, there's nobody who is a specialist in chronic pain. That you've got your head doctor, your back doctor, your stomach doctor, your knee doctor, your skin doctor, your digestive doctor, but nobody is a chronic pain doctor. And then what ends up happening? Well, tell us about what are some of the challenges with the fact that this is how our medical system.
Yeah. Yeah, again, because pain is such a human experience, we all have our own interpretation and understanding of pain to some degree, and that is typically that pain equals bad, pain equals tissue damage, pain equals something is wrong. And in the short term, that's typically true, right? Pain is a neurogenic or brain-driven phenomenon that we experience in our tissue, and it's a protective and productive function in its pure form. Like if you have your hand on the hot stove, it hurts for a very clear reason. You're doing damage to your tissue. You need to take action and pull your hand off, and hey, probably learn from that and avoid the hot stove in the future. Same if you have a broken bone or a sprained ankle or cancer growing in your tissue. You want to feel pain because it's going to get your attention and it's going to trigger you to take some sort of corrective action to learn from that. And the pain will persist typically for a short amount of time as the tissue heals and normalizes.
Right.
Chronic pain, however, is a different phenomenon. And again, all pain is coming from the brain, even though we feel it in the tissue. And in chronic pain, the brain becomes wired, essentially, to expect and to perpetuate the pain phenomena, regardless of what's happening in the tissue. But because we're kind of biologically driven and societally, conditioned to expect pain to mean something is wrong in the tissue, we always think it means something is wrong in the tissue. But in chronic pain, it typically isn't that way anymore, right? And so that's that's our own experiences. Doctors, clinicians are trained primarily in pain science from the 1960s. They lag behind in most cases. They get very little continuing medical education around pain, again, particularly chronic pain, because there's just not a lot of, so pain is a condition that's associated to many other conditions. It's typically like a symptom of some other problem. And there are pain specialists, but the training and the interventions that they use are typically not based upon the most recent sciences. That's kind of the problem. And we realize, if we think about our caveman ancestors, if they got hurt, the woolly mammoth attacked them or something, and they had pain, they would drink alcohol or they would take some plant-based, medicine, like probably opium, which is what opioids are now, essentially a chemical derivative of that. And those things are very, very effective in the short term at masking the pain. But because they're so effective in the short term, they mitigated the need to understand pain at a deeper level until now all of a sudden we have this huge opioid addiction epidemic. We go, holy cow, maybe we've approached this the wrong way.
Right.
Yeah. So it becomes pretty complicated. It really does.
It really does. And your book was an eye-opener in that regard of understanding that there's a newer understanding of pain, chronic pain, as being kind of a bad habit that the brain gets into.
Yeah.
It's like I'm a hypnotherapist, among other things. And when I was reading that, I realized, oh, this makes so much sense because, the subconscious mind or the brain, the nervous system, whatever you want to call it, just gets into a rut of a chronic cycle of a not so helpful habit. And the way you're presenting it, you're saying, there isn't a real reason for the pain. It's just like this loop that the brain is running.
Right.
And so that was fascinating because you're right. I think we're all kind of wired to think if I have this chronic pain, there's something wrong. And what you're saying is that in the majority of cases, there isn't. So now
Yeah,
go ahead, please.
I was just going to say there's actually studies that show a high correlation of the population who doesn't have pain. If you put them under imaging like MRI, they'll show herniated disc, they'll show arthritis, they'll show torn meniscus. I mean, there's tissue abnormality or tissue pathology, but they don't know it because it doesn't hurt. And conversely, the pain sufferers under imaging don't show a correlated presentation of that tissue abnormality. So there's really a disconnect between the tissue and chronic pain, even though we're not necessarily conditioned to think of it that way.
And so, in the cases of those who do maybe have a correlation, I'm thinking of the classic, back surgery patient where it's like, they've had chronic pain, they're like, oh, it looks like you have a herniated disc. And so, and then many of them get surgery. And you do mention some of these cases in your book, why a lot of them end up not having a huge relief of their pain. Is there any research or anything you want to mention on that, or?
Well, again, I mean, if we feel pain in our hip or our back or our knee, we think that that's the problem. But again, we have the pain because of the brain, right? And in most cases, if it's been months or years, the tissue should heal, and the body is made to heal itself. I mean, it really is a very remarkable adaptation machine. And so addressing it at the pain site may or may not really be the problem. And that's why you see people, a high percentage, I mean, 50-50 chance that back surgery will actually relieve back pain, even if there is tissue abnormality or something that looks like it. Because again, if you think about what I just said a moment ago, that the studies show there's a high percentage of people that don't have pain, that do have tissue abnormality. They don't necessarily go hand in hand. And so you can correct the physiology, the pathophysiology of what looks like, mechanical dysfunction, and the pain can persist. In fact, there's a diagnosis code called failed back surgery syndrome because it's so prevalent. Yeah, there's actually a reimbursement code for that. Yeah, or a diagnosis code.
Wow. So you came across this technology called Scrambler Therapy, right?
Yeah.
Did I say that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And so I would love for you to share with us, what is Scrambler Therapy, and how did you, because this isn't something you invented. So how did you first hear about it? What is it, and how did you hear about it?
Yeah, so in 2009, 2010, I was head of sales and marketing for a different medical device company, and helped bring this technology to market, this other technology, and then left the company to become a distributor for them. And as a distributor, I started looking for other technologies to add to my portfolio of products to be able to market. And I heard about this device, Scrambler Therapy, that is now central to our model at Radiant, and it was already FDA cleared. It had been researched at the Mayo Clinic and Johns Hopkins, and it promised pain relief without drugs, needle surgery, or side effects. It sounded, really quite exciting. So I began to put a lot of my own time and money and effort into promoting this technology, and found that doctors in most cases didn't understand the science. Therefore, it's hard for them to understand its mechanism of action or how it worked. Mm-hmm. And in many cases, probably most cases, there was a pretty strong economic disincentive for them to adopt it. There's a high cost for the technology, a lack of viable insurance reimbursement or insurance coverage, and a high opportunity cost in many cases for them to integrate it. And so realizing that this technology really had promise, but it needed to be commercialized in a different way.
Right.
I conceptualized this business idea, which is what we're doing at Radiant, which is to build clinics and build centers, which allow us to create a consistency in the brand, consistency in the client experience, and to create operating efficiencies. We're not having to operate inside the confines of the healthcare world with all its high costs and, frankly, sometimes misaligned incentives, and just build a business that's purely focused on how do we commercialize this technology in the most effective way. And while it's a completely different industry, I think the analog is to think about Starbucks. Starbucks has fundamentally changed society, and they changed how most of us consume, experience, value, pay for coffee. And they didn't do it by selling a better coffee product to the local diner. They did it by creating these stores that create an experience and create a brand. And that's really what we aim to do with Radiant.
Except in this analogy, you do seem to have a quite effective or better coffee.
We absolutely do, yeah.
Yeah. So tell us about how Scrambler Therapy works.
Yeah, again, so understanding that it's the brain in chronic pain that's the problem. The brain is wired kind of to expect and to perpetuate the pain phenomenon. Rather than addressing it at the tissue level, which is probably not the problem, or giving somebody a pill which just masks it, but inevitably leads to addiction or side effects or both, Scrambler Therapy, and this is an image of it here behind me,
Mm-hmm.
acts like an artificial nerve, and it generates a dynamic set of artificial nerve impulses that kind of mimic natural no pain nerve signaling in the body, essentially. We
Right.
attach electrodes on the skin in proximity to the pain, but in tissue that's healthy. So we don't go right in the painful area. We're not trying to mask the pain, but rather give the brain new information.
Right.
So if it's near the painful area, but in tissue that's not painful, we turn on the device and it transmits this information through the nervous system. The brain interprets it as a natural self-driven, set of information, and it begins to ease the pain response.
Mm-hmm.
The reason that technology is called Scrambler Therapy, and frankly, it's a bit of an unfortunate name. I think it's not one I would have picked had I commercialized this initially. But it's called that because the messaging is scrambled. So it's sent, it's then scrambled in the device and resent, scrambled, resent, scrambled, resent. So the brain is flooded over about a 40-minute session with a dynamic and changing set of information. And this is really important because it means the brain can't get used to it. It can't start to ignore it as background noise and become tolerant to it. It's forced to work to interpret this changing information, and that causes a neuroplastic change, or neuroplasticity is the term, but it means the brain's ability to change its plastic or moldable. And so basically we give new information. It breaks up these old wirings that are perpetuating the pain experience. It begins the brain's process of creating new normalized kind of pain experience modeling. And then through a series of sessions, we can reinforce that neuroplastic change and allow, in most cases, significant relief that becomes lasting for extended or even indefinite, in some cases, periods of time.
Yeah, which is incredible. And so for the lay people, that's me included, as I'm hearing you talk about this, we may not all be so conversant in neuroplasticity or new neural networks or pathways or whatever, but what you're making me think of is like muscle memory. It's what you're talking about. It sounds like you are essentially retraining the brain, much as you would, develop new muscle memory as to how to do a movement differently. Like learning a cartwheel, you do it with your right hand. Now you're going to try to learn it with your left hand. And it's just like the repetition of retraining the brain to learn this new kind of pathway that does not include pain.
Exactly. And it's important to point out, we're not making people superhuman. We're not taking away their ability to feel pain. It's really more of a restoration back to a more normal perception of pain. And so it's very safe. There's no side effects. And in most cases, it's life-changing outcomes that become lasting. And when somebody's able to start feeling better, they become educated about their brain. They become kind of empowered. Hope becomes rekindled back in their life where it once was really quite depleted, because pain robs them of really the best of who they are. It makes it harder to work. It makes it harder to maintain relationships. It makes it harder to sleep, to move. And then, if they're taking medications or just life, there's, often cognitive kind of impairment that comes from these things, or just emotional burden. There's weight gain. There's just withdrawal from all these things that really bring them the highest level of joy and satisfaction. So as we get people feeling better and they're able to get off of medications, they're able to plug back into these things at a really high level. And it just reverses this cascade of decline in a pretty profound way.
Right. Well, and the tricky thing with medication, we see it in all sorts of different fields, is kind of the medication cascade. It's like the medication, you get on the one and then you've got a side effect. So you get another one for the side effect and then another one for that side effect, So hopefully this helps people kind of backtrack all of that cascade of side effects on medications. So I'm sure that people listening and watching this, as they're hearing you talk about this, are wanting an example. So tell us a story or a couple of your favorite stories of, real cases of how this has helped.
Yeah. Well, we have, first of all, if you go to our website, we only use actual clients. There's no stock images. There's no, Google images that we've saved. These are all actual people whose lives have been restored back to a level of normalcy. And the stories that they'll tell you are profound and beautiful and literally life-changing. But just to give you a couple examples, and there's TV stations here in Portland, Oregon, where I live, that have covered these three stories in the evening news, and you can watch them. One is a gentleman who fell off a ladder about 12 years ago. He broke a bone in his foot, a fairly minor injury, but it was misdiagnosed. It didn't heal properly, and it led to an extended period of pain. He was given medications, physical rehab. Those things didn't really work. He was given injections. They tried surgery at the break site in the foot, trying to repair that, although by this point it really kind of already healed. He was given a spinal cord stimulator trial, which is a pretty invasive procedure in which they implant electrodes into the spine to, create basically an electrical stimulation to kind of block the pain signaling from the periphery or where the pain is felt and the nerve system. That didn't resolve his pain. He actually got addicted to opioids, put himself through rehab. And after all of this, he was so fed up and so miserable because none of this was resolving his pain. He just became more and more depressed and more uncomfortable. He went to his doctors and he elected to have his leg amputated. He chose and said, I just can't live this anyway. And he took the drastic measure of having his leg cut off. And they removed his leg. And unfortunately for him, it didn't resolve his pain because it's really not about the tissue. It's really a brain phenomenon, right? So he now had phantom pain. And phantom pain is something that probably most of your listeners, most of us have heard about. And, phantom pain is really a great way to understand chronic pain because phantom pain is, kind of an illustration that pain can exist regardless of what's going on in the tissue, even if the tissue's gone, right?
Yeah, the leg isn't there, but you still feel the pain, right?
Exactly. And so that's what this gentleman found himself in. And obviously now at this point, quite frustrated and depressed. Unfortunately, didn't take a drastic measure. Frankly, many of our clients tell us they thought about suicide because they just feel trapped in these bodies that are betraying them. But we treated him and he's back living his life, playing with his grandkids and having a, full and happy, productive life despite having a prosthetic on his leg.
Right.
And another couple examples, we have a woman, she's a nurse, a prominent medical facility here. And she had a double mastectomy after a cancer diagnosis, developed phantom pain of the breast to the point where she couldn't, really work. She said it was like having boiling oil poured over her chest on a constant basis. And it just disrupted every aspect of her life from work to family to, everything. And so, after having, again, tried so many other things, being a nurse, she's very well aware of what are the commonly prescribed approaches. None of that resolved until she came in to see us and she's back working full time, traveling for work, traveling for pleasure, spent a couple months in Europe with her daughters last year. And then another example, again, just because it's a TV documented story that your listeners can watch, is a dentist who played college basketball, was very athletic and fit and happy, began a dental career and developed pain in his neck and in his hands to the point where he couldn't hold the dental instruments anymore. And in his early 40s, had to give up his practice. I mean, he lost his profession, and then there's economic turmoil and family stress and all sorts of things that began to transpire. And again, tried many things, but after we treated him, there's video of him and, he's become a good friend of ours, but he's back juking around on the basketball court, playing basketball with his kids, and his life has been restored. He chose not to go back into dentistry because of the battle that he had in trying to get his insurance company to, honor their end of the deal with his liability insurance or whatever, or his professional insurance. But, remarkable stories of restoration, and that's pretty typical to what we see.
Yeah, that is extraordinary. And, with those examples, you've really illustrated how chronic pain can wreck someone's life, and people are driven, many of them have been driven to the point of suicide because of the chronic pain. And because, in the traditional models, we haven't found adequate treatment, right? So if somebody is listening to this and saying, wow, this sounds amazing. So how does it work? And this guy's in Oregon, so do I have to go out to Oregon? And what would that look like? So can you tell us a little bit about how getting the Scrambler Therapy treatment at the Radiant clinics works?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we are, for your listeners in Vermont or anywhere else in the world, we are only in Portland right now. We are raising money so that we can replicate it and grow it, hopefully everywhere as quickly as possible. And that's part of why I wrote the book, is because the book is a way to kind of tell our story, paint the vision for what we want to do, create interest in fans. Inc. magazine reviewed the book at the end of last year, and they called it a manifesto and an epic example of how to create a movement. And that's really what we want to do, is to create a movement, to shift society and to change the way that we understand pain. And so, we do definitely have clients that fly to us from across the country, throughout the world. They choose to come to us. They spend a few weeks with us, and that's a commitment in and of itself that's fairly costly and can be disruptive for people's lives. But to get their lives back, most of those people that make that decision to come here see the benefit. But our goal is to be able to open clinics everywhere throughout the country and North America and throughout the world as it makes sense. And so we have two ways, that if people are listening and they're going, wow, this is interesting. If you're a clinician, if you're a medical professional, a healthcare professional in some way, we have a very attractive business opportunity that's much, much more sensible than buying a very costly piece of equipment and then trying to figure out how do you integrate it into your existing clinic. Basically, they can invest in a local center and have a passive participation.
Yeah.
And then we've just recently filed with the Security and Exchange Commission, with the SEC, to be able to begin a crowd-funded public offering. So basically, it allows anybody for whom pain is a relevant problem, or the opioid addiction epidemic is of concern, anybody can invest, and through the aggregate we'll raise the money we need to be able to open clinics everywhere and hopefully deliver this over 10 years to a lot more people.
Right. Well, we'll have to support you on that. I think this is a really interesting concept. And so there's one point in the book that you mentioned something, and I'm like, oh, this is interesting. You say, we are not a pain clinic. And so I'm wondering, what's the difference? What does someone who expects a pain clinic, what's going to be the difference when they show up? I don't even know what a pain clinic looks like. So what's the difference between the two?
Well, this therapy and ancillary kind of supporting processes that we've built into it is all that we do. So unlike most pain clinics that are very much like a traditional doctor's office, our environment is much more spa-like. I don't have the best angle in here. It looks like a pretty bland wall, but I mean, there's color, there's warmth, and the entire clinic is much more like a spa than you would find in most traditional medical centers. We also don't have the same economic drivers and the same kind of experience, and it's all around this technology. And the therapy is obviously very safe and very effective, but our whole business structure has been built around how do we deliver that therapy in the most effective way. And so part of it is that we give the first treatment for free. We spend an hour prior to that treatment with each client, getting to know them and talking to them about some very important things, like their definition of success, their why, who needs them to show up, why do they need to get out of pain now, like why is this a priority now? And we start anchoring back to the goals and to the best of who they are, things that they maybe have forgotten about because they've just been in survival mode for so long. And we start getting focused back on that, and that changes the dynamic and it changes the experience pretty significantly. We then educate them about the science, and and then just in that process, even before the first treatment, which is typically pretty effective, that just the education and the knowledge and talking about their goals, hope starts to be rekindled in a way where oftentimes people get emotional because they go, oh my gosh, maybe there's a reason why my body has been betraying me. And even though none of my doctors have been able to explain this, maybe there is an understanding here that's different and there's hope. And to see them get emotional and to feel like, maybe there's a way out of this otherwise, life sentence of pain is really a beautiful thing to be a part of.
So I'm totally going to kind of go off my plan right now because I had written all these questions because I'm hearing you talk about this. And of course, I mentioned you don't know much about what I do outside of the show, but I mentioned earlier that I do hypnotherapy. That's just one of the tools in my bag. I'm a counselor, but my core practice is really in helping people connect the dots between their emotional landscape and their physical landscape, because a lot of times trauma, unresolved wounds show up in the body. So wearing that hat, I'm like, okay, if I didn't know about your pain treatments, if I were to work with anyone in this circumstance, I would say, all right, well, we've got to look at what's happening in the background of your subconscious mind in terms of trauma, emotional trauma, unresolved emotional things that are showing up in this chronic pain. Is that something that ever surfaces at your centers?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it's all interconnected. I mean, and the truth is, things like cognitive behavioral therapy, counseling, meditation, mindfulness, these can dramatically, significantly shift the pain experience in somebody's body. The challenge is that they're so uncomfortable, it's hard for them to sit and go through that process. They want something that's a little bit more immediate.
Right.
And, fortunately, this technology allows that, but 100%, because it's part of that. It's part of the process. In fact, the most recent neuroscience of pain is so fascinating and so multifactorial that emotions and trauma and environment and stress and family environments and upbringing, all of those pieces contribute to the interpretation of the pain experience in that person's body. Right. In the book I wrote, I make the analogy that we think of pain very cause and effect. Pain, something wrong. But if we step back and understand this a little bit better, the nervous system's job, its primary job above everything else, is survival. It wants to keep us alive, right? And so that means it needs to know everything that is a potential threat to our ability to stay alive. So that's threats in the environment, that's injury, that's trauma, that's, you know, a variety of different factors. And it's recording all these things that are potential threats to its ability to keep us alive. And it aggregates them and remembers them. If we're healthy, then it remembers them, but it kind of releases that stress. It doesn't aggregate it up. But for most of us, because we are stressed because of life circumstances, financial circumstances, marital relationships, you know, kids, whatever it is, you know, we're not always the healthiest in terms of what we eat and how much sleep we're getting, and, you know, mental hygiene and all the things that really help us to thrive, in your word, right?
Right.
Then there's kind of an aggregation, kind of like credit card debt. And then a simple thing like a small repair bill all of a sudden puts you over the tipping point, and the whole circumstance changes. Right. And now the brain thinks, oh my gosh, everything is a threat, right? And so even sensory experience like a light touch or sleeping or walking starts to be perceived as a potential threat. Right. And that's what causes the pain to persist. So it's not just a one-to-one ratio. I mean, our therapy is very good about reducing the pain experience in the body very quickly, endogenously, by giving the brain new information. But it does, you know, for most of our clients, it starts a cascade in which they say, I want to start moving better, sleeping better, eating better. I want to start thinking about my relationships, plugging back into work. And it's those people that do those steps that really thrive in the biggest ways, for sure.
They thrive when they engage on all dimensions. Because, you know, I've always found it curious that in the medical world, it's like the body is this mechanical thing, as if it were a car, you know, that as if our emotional landscape, our relationships, our life were taking place somewhere else, not in the body, you know? So I love that you take this complete, you know, integrative view of the entire picture of a person and their pain. So I also have something that was very curious to me as I'm, you know, reading your book, is that this is something the FDA knows about. This is a technology that's been tested, that, you know, there's the FDA paperwork. And so, you know, the person out there would say, well, if the FDA knows about it, how come this is not a thing?
Yeah.
So you've kind of touched on that, but can you elaborate for our listeners why this isn't something that people know about already?
Yeah. Well, it is FDA cleared. And so there's basically two types of FDA approval or clearance. One is cleared, meaning that it's safe for use in the market. The other is approved, and approved typically for very specific things that it's been tested for. Most devices are cleared, and it falls under that classification. But this technology, despite being very novel and very remarkable, was predicated on something called a TENS unit. And TENS therapy has been around for many decades now. It's basically an electrical stimulation that creates kind of an analgesic benefit while it's plugged on. And the analogy is, if I whack my hand on the table and my hand hurts, if I rub my hand, then my brain is feeling the rubbing sensation. And so the pain kind of feels diminished because it's getting this other sensory input. That's kind of how a TENS works, essentially, right? And so because of that TENS predication, Medicare, which sets the rate of what insurance reimbursements pretty much would pay for it, you know, basically said, well, TENS unit, this has been around forever, and it's really diminished the ability for a clinician to make a viable reimbursement from insurance, right? So that's but it costs a lot of money to, you know, to make these devices, to produce them, and, you know, everything. So there's an economic disparity there. And then again, because most clinicians aren't trained in the most recent neuroscience of pain, it sounds like snake oil, it sounds like voodoo. And I've been told by many doctors that, oh, you know, you're wasting my time, like there's no way you can create some sort of significant relief without some sort of drug intervention, because most medical doctors are trained in biochemistry, and they think of drug intervention. Yeah. So, I mean, there's multi-factors as to why, and, you know, insurance and FDA aren't necessarily correlated. And so even though it's FDA cleared, it doesn't mean at this point anyway there's a viable reimbursement. So we said, how do we create an economic business model that will make it as affordable as possible and still allow us to build a viable company? And I think we've done that. I mean, it's around $10 a day for most of our clients to get and maintain relief, which, you know, for the value they get in getting their life back and getting off of medications and quit spending money on things that aren't working, is
Yeah.
so much.
Oh, right. And probably the years of, you know, pain medications they've already paid for, you know, I'm sure that, yeah, you know, and it's, you know, I don't want to sound, it sounds like a cynical point, but the truth is, if that is what you're saying, that if there isn't a financial model for it to support, you know, I like to say to people, you know, the kale can be great and will be helpful in reversing a lot of health issues, but nobody's gonna, you know, pay for the research to make kale, you know, the solution, because there's no money to be made in, you know, eating more kale other than for the
Yeah.
farmer. So if the money isn't behind it, if there isn't a viable, you know, financial model behind it, the likelihood is that we're not really going to hear about it. So
yeah, and it does feel cynical, I think, when we say that and we think about that. But the reality is, I mean, just like in our own households, when you're a clinician and you're in private practice, for example, you have payroll, you have people that you have to take care of, you have, and you have an economic reality that is just the reality of what it is, right? And so to try to become creative and disrupt your own circumstance is really hard. In fact, most private practices across the country are dying. I mean, it's so hard to make the same kind of economic generation and profit that they once did. So that's why you see private practices selling to the hospitals or creating large groups, because, you know, there's a lot of economic challenge in working with insurance companies. You've got to contract and do prior authorizations, submit the bill, chase the money. Even that process alone is burdensome for most places. Yeah.
Wow, Brendon. So for those of you who may be just joining us, this is Morella DeVoe. We are on Thrive with Morella, and my guest is Brendon Lundberg, who's joining me from Portland, Oregon, and he's the founder of the Radiant Pain Relief Centers in Oregon, and he's also the author of the book Radiant Relief, A Case for a Better Solution to Chronic Pain, which you can find online. If you want to learn more about the Radiant Pain Relief Centers, you can go to radiantpainrelief.com, or also find Brendon and Radiant Pain Relief Centers on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and you can definitely connect with them and learn more about how it works and, you know, what it would take for you to go, you know, maybe start trying this out. For now, you're going to have to go to Oregon, but hopefully soon there might be some.
Yeah, we're working on a new center probably in the next 90 days or so, hopefully in Boston. So that's a little bit closer to you.
Oh, that, you know, people in Vermont drive down to Boston for medical reasons all the time. So that would be right in our backyard.
Yeah, and that we're in conversations with a number of doctors across the country. So our goal is, you know, 5 new centers in the next 12 months, and then hopefully many, many more as we scale it up.
Yeah. So, Brendon, is there anything that we haven't touched on that we think is important, that you might think is important for us to address?
Well, I think if anyone out there listening is a pain sufferer, I just want to stress there's hope, right? I mean, I know what it's like. I'm a pain sufferer myself, as you mentioned early on, and my pain is so mild compared to most people, but it gives me an insight into it. And in my book, I also talk about my wife's fairly complicated health journey that she was on. And I know personally how frustrating it is where your body is not operating in a way that makes sense, that doctors can't explain it, and how lonesome and isolating that feels. And so I want you to have hope. And I hope that if you have pain, that be able to help you. And even if we don't, like, you know, research some of the neuroscience of pain, because there are many things that can be done to help shift that. And, you know, we're conditioned to want to pop a pill and just mask it, but ultimately those things aren't serving us. And, you know, I think that's the important thing. I mean, I'm happy to tell my story more too, if you'd like.
I'm very curious. So tell us about your pain relief story.
Yeah. So ever since I was a teenager, I developed low back pain. And nobody could really explain why. You know, I'm healthy, fit, especially back then. You know, as a teenager, I was pretty active and athletic. And I had an uncle that was a chiropractor, so I'd get free adjustments, which I loved then, and I still love now. I think chiropractic care is a great modality, but it never fully resolved the pain with lasting results. It always felt good and always helped. But he remarked, even as probably a 17-year-old, it looks like I might be getting some scoliosis or some sort of malformation of my low vertebra. Well, fine. I kept getting adjustments that helped. Into my 20s, my younger sister, became a licensed massage therapist and an instructor at the massage therapy school. And so she started doing something called structural integration, which is really deep, kind of frankly painful massage. And she remarked too that it looked like my hips were doing some sort of strange rotation. And later on, I talked to a sports medicine orthopedist doctor who said, yeah, maybe some scoliosis or something's going on here, just degeneration. We'll watch it. Here's some medication. Here's some pills. You can pop these. If it gets worse, we might go in there and put in some rods and keep the back nice and straight. Obviously, I didn't really want to do that. Pain doctors basically said the same thing. Here's some pills. We can give you some injections. Eventually, if it gets worse, we go in there and surgically try to correct what's happening in the tissue. Well, I didn't do any of those things. I just kept living my life and, spent my career in healthcare related business. And even starting Radiant, I knew the technology seemed very promising, but I wasn't, and most of our team wasn't really expert in the neuroscience of pain. I mean, we've come there out of necessity as we've really been learning and understanding this over the last several years. And so anyway, I eventually got treated because I had developed, in addition to the low back pain that I had, I developed sciatica pain down my right leg and into my groin, which was very, very uncomfortable. And so I finally got treated here at Radiant. The sciatica pain went away in a matter of weeks and hasn't come back in 3 years. So that's been a huge blessing to not have to deal with that. And the mechanical pain in my low back is reduced to the point where it's rarely above a level 1 or 2. I mean, it's present, but it's very mild.
Yeah.
However, as we've studied the science, it's become very clear as to why, in my case, that might be present. Again, the nervous system's job is to keep us alive. So it's always working through sensory input, vision, the vestibular system, which is our balance system that keeps us upright and agile in our environment, the touching, feeling senses. So we know this is hot, this is cold, this is rough, this is smooth, this is sharp, this is dull. All of those have to work. And then what's called proprioception, which are our orientation in space and our body sense of spatial, positioning. So inevitably, for almost all chronic pain sufferers, we find that they develop some sort of what we call sensory mismatch or sensory dysfunction, if you will, between one of those sensory inputs and the brain. It's not working the way that it's supposed to gather, or the brain not interpreting that information as effectively as it might. And the result is the brain saying, hey, I don't know what's happening here in this part of your body, or in this way. My concern is, it's not obviously having this conversation, but this is what's happening, is like the brain wants to keep us alive. So if it's not getting the information to know how it's what potential threats are there in the environment, the result is a manifestation of pain, because pain above all else gets our attention and we go, okay, what's happening? So in my case, I have a right eye that doesn't really do its job. I see just fine. Like if I go to the eye doctor, I have similar eye vision in both eyes, but I walk around with my right eye kind of disconnected. And if I'm tired, if I've been drinking, it's even more pronounced. I kind of look like Forrest Whitaker, it kind of gets a little bit sleepy. And so because of that, my nervous system says if there's a threat in your environment, you're more vulnerable on your right side because your right eye is not paying attention. So it creates a very subtle adjustment in the positioning of my head so that my left eye is positioned to be more dominant. Well, that very subtle adjustment here requires compensation throughout the spine so that I keep walking straight, and the result is pain manifesting in my low back.
That is fascinating.
Yeah. And we see that with almost all, I mean, not the eye necessarily specifically, but some sort of sensory mismatch. And again, it's because the nervous system's job above comfort is survival, and it's generating the pain to get our attention. And if you think about phantom pain again, for example, that's probably boggled mankind since the first caveman ancestor lost a leg, from the tiger or whatever. And we think, well, it's because the nerves were cut and there's been damage to the tissue, but tissue heals, nerves heal. And the reason we now understand that somebody has phantom pain, let's say their foot has been amputated or lost in an accident, is because the foot used to give a lot of safety information or input information to the brain. Okay, I'm standing on stable ground. I'm standing in cold water, or whatever. And with the absence of that information, the brain goes, hey, there's a vulnerability here that I'm not comfortable with, and I'm going to create pain to get your attention so you can hopefully give me information.
Right. What's going on?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
And that's why you see things like mirror therapy really work, because I don't know if you've heard of mirror therapy, but so they use a mirror to mirror the other foot that's still present. And the brain's going, okay, I see my foot now.
There it
and
is. Yeah.
you can caress it, right? And so you're giving your brain this sense of information that goes, okay, and it eases the pain experience. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's fascinating stuff to me. I love it.
It is fascinating stuff. Yeah, that when the brain sees in the mirror there's the missing foot is there just by seeing the reflection in the mirror. It's amazing that it would start to, unscramble. And I don't know that it's the right word, but so Brendon, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, I'm so excited for your work. I'm excited for the people who are finding lasting and sometimes complete relief from their chronic pain, and just seeing the change in their lives. So that's exactly what the show is about. It's about thriving, and so I'm sure that they would say that they're thriving in a way that hadn't been possible to them before. So I'm really grateful for your work, and I'm a cheerleader for you. I really look forward to more people having access to this. Again, my guest today is Brendon Lundberg. He's the co-founder of the Radiant Pain Relief Centers in Portland, hopefully coming to more places in the US, maybe Boston soon. And he's also the author of the book, Radiant Relief, A Case for a Better Solution to Chronic Pain, which you can find online. And you can find the Radiant Pain Relief Centers at radiantpainrelief.com. Brendon, this has been wonderful. Thank you for joining me on the show today.
It's been my absolute pleasure. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.
And to our listeners, we will be listening to some music before we wrap up. This is Thrive with Morella, the show for people who want to thrive, body, mind, heart, and spirit. Oh, wow. Thank you.
Thank you, Morella. That was a lot of fun.
Yes, I enjoyed it a lot, and I'm really looking forward to downloading the video and being able to share that and share the podcast as well. So I'll be sharing that with you this week as soon as we can get it.
Yeah.
I'll download it and put it up on social media.
We'll republish it, or whatever the right term is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Cool.
Well, I'll be keeping I'll be keeping an eye out for you, and just seeing what you're doing with Radiant, because I think it's really exciting. And I think that what's happening in the medical world, I think disruption is the perfect word. I think that we are ready for disruption to take place in not just the medical, but the insurance world. And so I'm very excited for what you're doing.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's been a real honor to be with you.